almost half a year into Russia's war against Ukraine, the question of collective responsibility is being raised. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is calling on Europe to ban all Russians from entering the EU. And some countries are ready to raise the Iron Curtain once again, or at least partially. Finland will reduce the number of visas issued to Russians by 90%, while Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia are restricting tourists' visas. Partying on the streets of Europe is in no way a human right, but would this measure affect Putin's base? Out of 144 million people in Russia, less than 30% hold external passports, a document that allows you to travel outside the country. While asylum seekers, dissidents, and journalists enter Europe on tourist visas before applying for refugee status. So, is collective punishment the way to go? And should Russian citizens be held accountable for their country's actions?
So let's get to it. Should Russian citizens be held accountable for their country's action? Let's kickstart the debate with a 30-second round each, and then we pick up the conversation right after. So Alexandra, please take the lead.
Yes, so if that's me who's starting, I must begin by saying that, again, this discussion is almost a minor, it's a minor issue against the backdrop of people dying or fleeing their homes. And even right now, as we speak, people are in danger in Ukraine. So we're talking about a minor issue here. But I believe that since it's on the table and since it's being discussed, especially in Washington Post, especially by all the politicians, political leaders, I think that collective accountability is undermined by the lack of clarity about who is responsible to whom and for what.
Interesting.
And it spreads accountability.
Interesting, and we'll of course elaborate on that in a split second. Alexander, please, your thoughts.
Well, I think that no matter how hard it is, but we should realize that the evil is being committed on behalf of our country, and we shall take the responsibility for the whole country. I don't say that the level of guilt is the same to all of the people, but I think that knowing from the German experience, we must take this responsibility.
Last but not least, Dan Perry, your thoughts?
This is a situation that defies a simple yes or no. I mean, it is unfair and generally ineffectual to hold a population accountable for the actions of a dictatorial government that it did not elect. And although the Russians did kind of elect Putin in a semi-free election years ago, it no longer applies. On the other hand, a horrible crime is being committed in their name, and a statement probably should be made. So some in-between solution where visas are effectively massively restricted, but it's done on a case-by-case basis with allowances for humanitarian needs and so forth, may be the right way to go.
And from this point onwards, dear panelists, please feel free to interact. And just to note or clarify, the fact that we're handling or carrying out this mere conversation does not mean that we're undermining by any means the atrocities or suffering on the Ukrainian side. But I do want to insist on the morality of collective punishment, and this potential measure can be seen as a form of collective punishment, Dan Perry.
Well, I mean, I think we have to distinguish between democratic countries and non-democratic countries. If a polity can be said to have chosen a given path that the rest of the world or parts of the world disagree with, I don't see anything immoral about putting pressure on that polity. I mean, there are consequences to electoral outcomes. Of course, the case of Russia is fuzzy because it started off as a developing democracy when Putin was first elected. He was legitimately then elected. It went on to be a flawed democracy, increasingly flawed, eventually a fake democracy, now a non-democracy. So what do you do when citizens are clearly not directly responsible for a policy does become a moral question. By the way, you see it in Israel as well. Israel effectively is trying to get the people of Gaza to overthrow Hamas by putting pressure on the people of Gaza. And I think there will be some concern also in Israel about the idea that collective punishment might extend one day to them also.
You know what? Let's continue with this train of thought. Speaking of pressure on the administration through the citizens, isn't there a chance, Alexandra, that this measure, or you know what, Alexander, perhaps you're the better address to this question, this measure will essentially strengthen Putin in his narrative to fuel anti-Western sentiments?
Well, unfortunately, we have to admit this fact that indeed this whole rhetoric of prohibiting even tourists, first of all, tourist visas, only help Vladimir Putin. It doesn't help to stop him. It doesn't help to stop the war, but that unfortunately even to some extent help Vladimir Putin to elaborate on that rhetoric that you see this whole West world is just Russophobic and they just hate you guys. And it's more of actually this step is quite, we understand that this step is being done just because it's very important from the perspective of elections in Western countries, because people support this from the psychological perspective that, okay, we punish them and that's a good tool. But unfortunately, in reality, it doesn't help at all to stop Vladimir Putin. And moreover, there are only 5 to 10% of Russian tourists coming to Europe comparing to pre-COVID period. So there are not so many of them. And mostly Russian activists right now use tourist visa as a as an insurance, as a tool to get out of the country when they know that criminal case is being initiated or things like this. So right now, tourist visas are not being used like a privilege, you know.
And also, I have to say, the existing sanctions regime does enable the prevention of people who may be more directly responsible for what's happening in Russia to do tourism in Europe, or indeed to have property in Europe or in the West. I mean, there are existing aspects of existing sanctions regime that do enable punishing people who have a more direct hand in enabling the crimes committed by Putin.
And Alexandra, very bluntly, I will ask, how will it help Ukraine?
Well, that's one of the main questions, I would say. I think that this act prohibiting Russians to travel, or prohibiting Russian tourists, even tourists to travel, I don't know how it will directly help Ukraine, because the main idea right now is to stop the war. That's the main idea and what everyone wants. And to add to what's already been said about the people who have a more direct hand in it, and stopping them would probably help Ukraine much more, because they must stop financing the war, and Russia should not be able to buy weapons and to produce weapons anymore. But if we look at the Forbes list of 200 richest Russians, there are only 46 of them under sanctions, under EU or US or UK sanctions right now. And those oligarchs are absolutely, as it's been said, they have a direct hand in what's happening, and they're sponsoring the war right now, but not as much as simple everyday Russian is. And I really don't see how not seeing Russians in Europe, apart from this being a psychological realm, how could it help Ukrainians?
So can we dub it as merely this desire of vengeance, so to speak, which is, again, understandable perhaps in the context of war, but when we're talking practicality, there is none? Dan?
Well,
please, Alexandra, please.
Yeah, no.
Please.
No, I'm sorry. Yes, it's just, again, it's if we look at it from the political realm, politically, it is now very profitable, of course, for politicians in Europe, and it's absolutely understandable, and I fully understand. And I think I would say the same things if I were in Ukraine, or I am half Ukrainian, but I mean, I'm a Russian citizen still. So I absolutely understand. It's fully understandable, absolutely understandable that sentiment. But what does it do? Does it help Ukraine in any way? Does it stop the war, or does it help Putin? I would say that it helps President Putin, as it's been said, 57 million votes he got on the latest election, and almost 20 million were thrown in. So how can we talk about collective responsibility? Maybe only those 57 million responsible, or 40 million if we're talking about votes thrown in. And now it looks like those people who are directly involved are not that much sanctioned as they probably should be.
Yeah, and
I would certainly agree that there are many steps that the EU and the West can take to increase the sanctions on those directly responsible in ways that would have more of an impact and embroil the West less in the moral question of whether they are doing collective punishment, and indeed perhaps hurting the very people who would be their allies in a future more democratic Russia. So there's much more to be done, I think, before this step.
Yeah, so just to clarify, as we are nearing at the end of the first part of our debate, Alexander, as you mentioned, of 144 million people in Russia, less than 30% even hold foreign passports, most of them in big cities, not necessarily Putin's base, right?
Well, actually,
yes, absolutely.
Sorry.
Sorry, that's Alexander. Alexander.
Yeah, my apologies.
He should answer definitely.
I mean, it just sounded a bit similar as long as...
Again, my poor pronunciation is messing it up, but please, Alexander.
Okay, you may just call me Alex, if there are plenty of us. So, well, absolutely sure. I'm absolutely sure that, unfortunately, this travel ban and this rhetoric hurts only the pro-European Russians, which is the weirdest part of this ban. But at the same time, we should realize that we Russians right now, unfortunately, are not the ones who have a moral right to say what should be done or what should not be done. But that doesn't. But I have no problems in taking responsibility, my part of responsibility. I've been doing opposition politics for 11 years, but I was not successful. So probably I did something wrong. But at the same time, these rhetoric from European leaders might sound a bit hypocritic just because we've been warning Europe for almost 20 years who Vladimir Putin is. I mean, it's 15 years since Munich speech. It's 14 years since the first annexation. And even after in Georgia, even after the Crimea, some of the European leaders were continuing hugging Vladimir Putin, greeting him as a best friend, giving him money, trading with him. And now, only Russians are responsible. So this is the weirdest part of it.
Wow, stronger remarks there, Alex. On that note, we will conclude the first part of our debate. But Alexandra, Alex, and Dan, you're staying with us because we continue our discussion right after, as we have a whole lot to discuss, perhaps more from the European standpoint, as you've been alluding to. So we're taking a 4-minute break, and we're back with much more. Welcome back to the summit. Still with us, Dan Perry, Alexandra Filippenko, and Alexander Solovyov. Thank you all very much for staying with us. We continue our discussion, obviously staying on topic, but before we dive back into the conversation, let's take a listen to some of the remarks by European leaders on this issue.
Ordinary Russian people didn't start the war, but at the same time we have to realize that they are supporting the war. I think it's not right that Russian citizens can travel, enter Europe, Schengen area, be tourists, see the sightseeings while Russia is killing people in Ukraine. It's wrong.
I think it is understandable why some Europeans, and maybe especially some Ukrainians, find it a bit strange that Russia has attacked a European country. There's a war in Europe, and at the same time we are receiving tourists from the same country that has attacked another country.
It was an important decision of all of us that we imposed sanctions on those who are responsible for the war, and a lot of oligarchs and those who are financially and economically profiting from this Putin regime. And we will continue to do so. But I think this is not the war of the Russian people, it is Putin's war, and we have to be very clear on that topic.
So let's get to it. Is it yet another topic to drive a wedge, so to speak, between EU countries? Let's start with another 30-second round each. Alexander, please take the lead.
Well, as I've already mentioned, yes, from the one hand, some of the politicians, Russian politicians, are still not under sanctions, but meanwhile, Russian citizens are under sanctions. So this is just ineffective. I don't think that it really helps to stop the war, and I don't think that tourists who now travel to Europe are supporting the war.
Alexandra, your take?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are complex solutions for European politicians, for American politicians, like oil and gas embargo, the hardest issues for them. But then there are really simple ones, like personal sanctions. They don't require anything but a political will. But is there a political will? It doesn't look like there is one. Again, revenues flowing into Kremlin are booming, are skyrocketing. They doubled in the first 100 days of war. And of course, European politicians saw that. And regarding driving a wedge, I'm not sure it's about driving a wedge, but rather about winning elections.
Yeah, that's a familiar tune. Dan Perry, your take?
This clearly drives a wedge in the sense that there's going to be disagreement on what is a complex issue, but I think the major wedges in Europe are other, on whether they want to have a more complete union, a common defense and foreign policy, more relevant to Russia perhaps, the energy policy issue, and maybe primarily immigration. So this, at the end of the day, I think while there will be disagreements, will not be a major wedge in Europe.
And again, I will continue to insist just a slight more on that particular policy, and please feel free to interact from this point onwards. Dan, what about asylum seekers holding the same type of visas? If the EU decides to give a green light to this policy, will that affect them?
Well, I mean, clearly I agree. I mean, I mentioned before, I think the wisest thing, maybe a Solomonic answer to this impossible question would be to indeed diminish the number of visas, make a point of projecting that they're punishing the Russian people, whether or not they deserve it, and maybe they do kind of deserve it, because the polls do show that the war is popular in Russia, and I think the polls may be right in this regard, while at the same time enabling significant exceptions for asylum seekers and for others who clearly are not to blame and who have good reason to be in Europe.
And Alexander, Alex, if I may, perhaps the glass half full or the silver lining in this potential pending policy, perhaps shaking up political resistance in Russia.
Well, unfortunately, travel ban and any kind of the ban based on the nationality or based on the country of origin does not help to shake up this resistance back in Russia. It only frustrates people with pro-European minded people, because.
Oh, but Alex, are you totally sure that over time that will remain the case? I understand how in the short term people just get more nationalistic and they circle the wagons when they're being punished. But I think this attaches to a bigger question, which is, despite the fact that Russia is not a dictatorship, do you think that if you put enough pressure on the Russian people, maybe in areas where they care about more than travel to Europe, that there could be sufficient change coming from below to force a change either in the actions of the regime or in the nature of the regime?
I don't think that the travel ban may cause sufficient effort coming from the like a grassroots movement or something, because Russia is a dictatorship. I've been living there for my whole life. I know what's living in a dictatorship, what's being put into prison for words. This is armed dictatorship. You cannot do anything against armed dictatorship unless you are ready to wage a war, a civil war. And I don't think there are enough people to wage a civil war. Yet that doesn't mean that Europe should not try to divide the society, in a good meaning, to show that actually there is an alternative, and that living in a dictatorship is not normal, is not okay. The travel ban does not actually help to do that. So
sure, but what I meant is, could there be other things other than a travel ban? Let's suppose we all agree a travel ban is only going to affect the nice Russians. Could there be other things that would hurt the public at large enough to cause essentially a revolution?
I don't think that hurting. Well, actually, economic sanctions do work. So, in a long perspective, they just don't work that fast as European citizens wish them to do. But in a long perspective, they actually ruin Russian economy. But unfortunately, and that makes them poorer, really poorer. I mean, literally. But unfortunately, Vladimir Putin doesn't care about this because our population is already poor, and they're pretty much proud of being able to suffer that much. So it's kind of a crooked proud of being able to suffer as much as possible. So I don't think that. I just think that Europe should encourage those who think different. And first of all, take care of those who live in Europe and still support Vladimir Putin. I mean, those should be really studied. I mean, those cases, because the biggest problem does not come from tourists. The biggest problem comes from those pro-Putin so-called vatniki who live mostly in Germany or in other different countries, and they still support Vladimir Putin. And they say that no, this is not true, that Russia attacked Ukraine and everything is staged and things and so far. And going back to your words about the polls, I don't think this is relevant to to discuss polls being conducted in a military dictatorship. So, but of course, we should conduct that. We should continue doing that.
Well,
at least
but do you think the polls are wrong?
Trends.
I mean, is it not true that there is strong support?
I'm absolutely sure. Listen, we had 6 waves of big polls, and the very last of them show that the percentage of denying, rejecting and denying, continuing answering the questions after the questions were covering the war was like 92% or something. As long as people hear questions about the war, they immediately stop this poll. Immediately.
Yes.
Because you can go up to jail up to 15 years just for words.
Yes,
and
we're running out of time. So, Alexandra, briefly, if you can, obviously we all agree that practically it will not help, but will it, quote unquote, satisfy Ukrainians, so to speak, to see Russians, plural, getting, quote unquote, punished?
Maybe that would satisfy, maybe that the psychological part, maybe that would help, and that would be also good. But I would just like to add a few things regarding what can really be done. And if we look at, first of all, if we look at Belarus in 2020, we can see that even peaceful protests, they don't really work, those massive protests. Yeah. But when were the most massive protests in Russia? In 2012. When, I participated
yes,
in all
of them.
And
great devastation. We ran out of time. I would love to continue this debate with you, hopefully soon. Thank you all so very much for your insights. It was a pleasure. Hope to see you soon again.